I'm here with Maile Meloy and Doug Dorst, whose two books of short stories, Both Ways is the Only Way I Want It, and The Surf Guru, are now available. And I wanted to talk to both of you about what I'm seeing. We're seeing a bit of a renaissance in terms of short stories. And I'm interested why you think people today are responding to short stories at all. Maile, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think people are writing such good ones, and I also think short stories are perfect for our shortened attention spans. People sort of say that television killed the magazine short story by giving people a different way to get their half-hour narrative fix. But it seems like our total constant media flood might have sort of brought it back, because you can have a whole experience in 10 to 20 pages.
Is that your experience too, Doug? Or?
I had heard, certainly from a lot of people, that if I read fiction, I only read novels. And I think that the more that the story has picked up, the more that it's become something that people are likely to investigate. There's a lot of really good work being done right now.
Well, the perception, and again, please correct me if you disagree, the perception was always that the short story was for a more of a literary audience, as opposed to a novel generally would have a broader appeal depending on what kind of novel it is. But I think from what you're saying now is because of the quality of the work, more and more people are coming to short stories or looking at collections of short stories in a way that might differ from what they had done, say, 10 years ago. Is that your perception, or do you have a kind of other point of view on that?
I've been to a lot of book clubs and events this year with this book where people tell me they never, ever read short stories, but they made an exception for me.
Nice of them to say that to you while you're in front of them, right?
Isn't it? But I'm happy. I think there are people who really like to live in a novel for a long time and maybe didn't think of short stories, like you said, as an option. But, I like going back and forth as a reader and as a writer, so I'm trying to win them over one person at a time.
That actually raises an interesting point. Do both of you approach writing short fiction differently than you approach a novel or a longer form fiction?
Well, not at the very beginning, because at the very beginning I don't necessarily know what form it wants to take. But certainly when I do commit to something, being a story or something of greater length, then the demands of that form with a short story, you've got to make sure that absolutely every word counts, every word designed to work toward a unity of effect. It's a much more compressed medium. I mean, I still might overwrite it in a draft and then try to compress it. In fact, that's likely what I do. And I think with a novel, you've got a little more room to investigate what's out there, and it's a different kind of revising for the novel as well.
So the idea is there, and it takes a while for you to determine ultimately whether it is a short story or can be amplified into a novel.
Yeah, for me, definitely.
Is that true for you too, Maile?
My first novel, Liars and Saints, began as 2 linked short stories, but that was before I'd ever written a novel, and I think that was kind of my way into writing a novel. Mm-hmm. In general, since then, I feel like I have story-sized ideas and novel-sized ideas, so I generally know which is which, and I actually tried earlier this year on demand to write a short story set in the world of the novel I want to write next, and it was a disaster because it was just a novel-sized world that didn't make any sense.
Obviously you've gone back and forth from short fiction to the novel and now these collections of short stories. Either one of you think that writing successful short stories, which you obviously both have done extremely well here, does that change or modify how you write longer form fiction? What do you think, Doug?
There are probably lessons that I learn while writing one that I can bring to the other. I think in general they're fairly separate for me.
How about you, Maile?
I think that story writing made me more efficient or more interested in efficiency as a novelist. But they do feel different as you're writing them, certainly.
Are there particular writers whose short stories you're drawn to as readers?
Tops on my list is George Saunders. Every Saunders story that I read does something different for me and something interesting and something unexpected and often something hilarious.
How about you, Maile?
Yeah, I love his stories too. Early on, I was reading all the Cheever stories and felt like when I was having trouble with a story, I would think, what would Cheever do? J.D. Salinger's 9 stories, I feel like, is sort of a perfect model, and every story in it is funny and sad and unexpected, and
Well, some of those, the stories that you, and particularly the Salinger stories, at least to me, it feels as if the story's placement is very specific and very intentional. When you two have your collection of short stories, do you see the stories in a particular arc or an order in terms of, sort of what you want to say, or does the kind of order occur to you as you work through them, either by yourself or with your editors? Talk a little bit about that process of kind of creating a collection as opposed to the individual stories.
I definitely put a good deal of thought into the sequencing of the book. I think my collection of Surf Guru it's a bit different. The stories in my collection range pretty far afield in terms of form, style, tone. So it's not as, in a way, it's sort of like the opposite of the linked collection of stories. I wanted to take things as far in as many directions as I could. Question of rhythm and tone, trying to figure out what the reading experience would be like. That was the guiding principle for me.
Did you have the same experience, Maile? Did you sort of know where you wanted things to go?
Not when I began, because I write them one at a time and only sort of figured out how they fit together when I started putting them into a collection. And at that point, I knew which one I wanted to go first, and I knew which one I wanted to go last. And between that, it feels like a puzzle with only one answer, and you just have to figure out what the answer is. Because there are some stories that need to go early and some stories that can't go early. I have a story in which there's a murder that I think you need to build up some trust with the reader before you get to it. And I also think it needs a lighter story after it. So I think it's hugely important to the experience of the book as a whole. And what I do is I put the titles and these little codes for myself about where they're set and whether the protagonist is male or female and if they're in first or third person. And I move those sticky notes around in order that makes sense, and I read it in that order, and then if something doesn't work, I change it again.
That's a great idea. I'm going to steal that.
It's great. Cut up sticky notes. Sometimes I have codes from the first book that I don't understand. There are all these letters, and I know what some of them mean, and others I have no idea what I was trying to tell myself.
In terms of what you'd like to do going forward, in terms of the kinds of stories you'd like to continue to write or explore and that you haven't done before.
Always on the lookout for new forms with which to tell a story, narrative approaches that you might not necessarily expect. One of my favorite stories is by Daniel Orozco. It's called Officers Weep, and it's a story told entirely in the form of police reports, which obviously I can't do because he beat me to it. But I want to be on the lookout for that form that could just be, I might not know exactly what I want to do with it, but when I see a form that I want to use, it's nice to start playing with that, and something unexpected might come out of it.
How about you, Maile?
Same thing. I always want to try to do something I haven't done before. I think it sort of helps keep me interested. And about story and form, I'm a total narrative junkie. I'm all about the story.
Well, that actually raises a sort of a final point, is that you can, in a short story, you can be both voice-driven and also, for lack of a better term, narrative-driven in terms of if there's a particular story that you would want to tell. And in both The Surf Guru and Both Ways Is the Only Way I Want It, you two have written two extraordinary collections that have unbelievably involving voices, while at the same time you tell stories that illuminate the experience of both the characters and sort of holding up a mirror to the reader himself or herself. So as a reader, I'd like to thank you both.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Not at all.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
That was Maile Meloy and Doug Dorst. Miley's book, Both Ways Is the Only Way I Want It, is out in paperback now. Doug Dorst's new collection, The Surf Guru, is available in hardcover everywhere.